I know this is difficult to hear. We'll go through this together.
Okay.
There are moments in life that split everything in two, before and after. The moment before you opened that message, the moment before the phone rang at 2 a.m., the moment before a doctor slid a piece of paper across a table and quietly told you that the life you believed in, the life you built, the life you defended to your family and your friends and yourself, was never real. Diana Carter had always believed that love, real love, was something you could feel in your bones. She believed she had that. She believed she had chosen well. She believed, after 4 years of marriage, that she knew the man sleeping beside her. She was sitting in a clinic waiting room on a cold February morning when a nurse called her name, led her down a hallway, and placed her in a room that smelled like antiseptic and fluorescent light. She was not prepared for what came next. She was not prepared for the ultrasound image that would end her marriage, expose a decade of calculated deception, and connect her to women she had never met. Women who had loved the same man, trusted the same smile, and paid a price they are still paying today. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something. This is not a story about a cheating husband. That would be painful enough on its own. But this is something else entirely. This is a story about a man who spent years constructing a version of himself so convincing, so carefully built, that the people closest to him, smart people, educated people, people who considered themselves good judges of character, had absolutely no idea who they were really dealing with. This is a story about what happens when one medical scan cracks a lie wide open. And this is a story about 7 women who sat in a courthouse hallway and looked at each other for the very first time, realizing they had all been living inside the same carefully constructed illusion. The questions at the center of this story are simple, but the answers are anything but. What exactly did the doctor see in that ultrasound that made her urge Diana to leave her husband immediately? What had Marcus, Diana's husband, the man everyone in their community admired, been hiding, and for how long had he been hiding it? And the question that Diana herself says she still turns over in her mind late at night, was there ever a moment she could have known? Was there ever a crack in the performance that, if she had looked at it differently, An would have told her the truth? Stay with me, because every answer we find in this story leads to a harder question underneath it. Diana Carter grew up in Columbus, Ohio. She was the middle child of 3, raised by a schoolteacher mother and a father who spent 30 years as a firefighter before his knees gave out, and he retired to a small workshop in the garage where he built furniture nobody ever sat on. By every account, and I spoke with several people who knew Diana from childhood through adulthood, she was the kind of person a room tilted toward. Not because she was loud or flashy or performed for attention, but because of something quieter than that. A quality her oldest friend described to me as a kind of realness that you don't run across very often. Diana was the friend who showed up, who remembered what you told her 3 months ago and asked about it, who brought food when someone was sick and stayed longer than she had to and never once made you feel like you were a burden. She put herself through nursing school working weekend shifts at a diner in Clintonville, graduated with honors, and by 27 was working in a regional hospital in Columbus in a cardiac unit where her colleagues described her as one of the most composed, dependable nurses on the floor. She was not naive. That is the first thing everyone who knows her wants to make absolutely clear. She was not naive. She was not careless. She was not someone who ignored warning signs because she wanted the fairy tale. She was a woman with a medical degree's worth of training in how human bodies fail, how human systems break down, how things that look fine on the surface can be catastrophically wrong beneath it. And she still didn't see it coming. Which tells you something important about how good Marcus really was at what he did. Marcus Calloway walked into a hospital charity fundraiser on a Tuesday evening in October, and Diana noticed him before he noticed her. That part she is very clear about. She saw him across the room, tall, composed, the kind of man who stands at a social event like he belongs there and has always belonged there. And her first thought, she told a close friend the next morning, was that he looked like someone who had been deliberately designed to be trusted. She meant it as a compliment at the time. Marcus was 34 years old, a finance director at a mid-sized pharmaceutical company. Polished in the way that comes not just from money, but from years of carefully studying how to present yourself. He remembered names. He asked follow-up questions. He pulled out chairs and held doors without making it feel performed. He coached a youth basketball team on Saturday mornings. He volunteered at a food pantry twice a month. He donated to causes that his coworkers didn't even know about because he didn't mention them. They only came out later, during the investigation. In financial records, nobody was looking for that particular detail in. On the night he met Diana, he spent 40 minutes talking to her about her work, her patients, what had drawn her to nursing in the first place. He did not talk about himself unless she asked. And when she did ask, and every answer he gave was interesting and warm and just self-deprecating enough to feel genuine. Diana drove home that night thinking she had just met someone remarkable. She was not wrong about that. She was only wrong about what kind of remarkable he was. They were married 18 months after they met, in a ceremony at a converted barn venue outside Columbus on a Saturday in late September when the leaves had just started to turn. Diana's father gave a toast that made the entire room reach for napkins. Her younger sister stood at the altar beside her and later said it was the happiest she had ever seen Diana look. Marcus had planned a honeymoon in Portugal. 2 weeks, small boutique hotels, no resort crowds. He had researched every restaurant they ate at, and he had booked a private walking tour of Lisbon on their 4th day because Diana had once mentioned, on their 2nd date, that she had always wanted to see the city from its hills. She had not reminded him of that. He had remembered on his own. For the first 2 years of the marriage, Diana would describe their life together the way you describe something you are afraid to jinx by naming too directly, as genuinely good. Not a performance of happiness, not the curated version people put on social media. Actually good. They cooked together on Sunday evenings. They drove up to Michigan one long weekend every summer. They disagreed about money and whose family to visit at Christmas, and whether the thermostat should be at 68 or 71. The way real couples disagree about real things. And Diana, and for all of her clinical training in reading people and reading situations, felt safe. She felt for the first time in her adult life entirely uncomplicatedly safe, which is exactly what Marcus needed her to feel. Before we go any further into the story, I want to pause for just a moment and ask you something. If you're watching this right now, take a second and think about how well you know the person closest to you. Not what you assume about them. Not what they've told you about themselves, but what you actually, independently, verifiably know. Most of us, if we're honest, know a great deal less than we think. And that gap, between what we believe about someone and what is actually true, is exactly the space Marcus Calloway had been living in his entire adult life. The first crack appeared in the 3rd year of the marriage, and it was so small that Diana almost missed it entirely. Marcus had asked her to grab his phone off the charger one morning, and when she picked it up, the screen lit up with a message preview from a contact saved only as the letter R. She didn't read the message. She put the phone on the counter next to his coffee and went upstairs to get ready for her shift. She told herself it was nothing. A work contact. An abbreviation. One of 100 reasonable explanations for a single letter on a phone screen. But the letter R stayed with her. Not loudly. Not as an accusation. More like a low-frequency sound you can't quite locate. You're not sure if you're really hearing it or just becoming aware of the silence around it. Over the following weeks, she noticed other things. Small things. The kind of things that, written down on a list, would look like the inventory of a paranoid mind. Marcus had started taking certain calls in the garage. He kept his phone face down on tables in a way he hadn't before. He was unreachable for stretches on Thursday evenings. Not completely. Not in a way that would trigger an alarm, but in the particular way of a man who is somewhere he doesn't want to have to explain. What investigators would later describe in their formal report as a pattern of compartmentalization had been building inside Marcus and Diana's marriage for longer than Diana realized at the time. Looking back, and Diana has had a great deal of time to look back, she can now identify the architecture of it. The way he managed information, the way he kept different parts of his life in sealed containers that never touched each other. He had a second email address she didn't know existed, routed through a provider he'd been using since before they met. He had a credit card linked to a P.O. box 3 towns over, opened in a version of his name, Marcus C. Trent, that Diana had never heard. The Thursday evenings had been consistent for at least 8 months by the time Diana started quietly noting them. 6 to 9 p.m., unreachable or slow to respond. Always home by 9:30 with a plausible explanation. A work dinner that ran long, a buddy's pickup basketball game, a project that needed finishing at the office. Each explanation, on its own, was entirely ordinary. It was only when you laid them all in a row, week after week, that the shape of something deliberate began to emerge. Oh, but here is the thing about a person who is genuinely skilled at deception. And Marcus was, by any objective measure, extraordinarily skilled. They do not give you a single large lie to catch. They give you 100 small truths with the important parts removed. And when you are someone who loves that person, who has built a life with that person, who has staked your sense of safety on that person, the mind does something entirely human and entirely understandable. It fills in the missing parts with the most generous available explanation. Because the alternative, that the person beside you in bed is not who you believe them to be, is a thought so disorienting that the brain will work very hard to avoid it. By February of the 4th year of their marriage, Diana had been experiencing symptoms she couldn't easily explain away, on a fatigue that went beyond her long hospital shifts, a persistent low-grade fever that came and went without a clear source. And something else, something she recognized, with the quiet dread that comes from clinical knowledge as potentially significant. She made an appointment at a clinic across town, not at her own hospital. She was deliberate about that. She told herself she was being cautious about privacy, that she didn't want to be treated by colleagues, which was true. But there was another reason she didn't examine too closely, a reason that lived in the part of her mind where the letter R and the Thursday evenings and the face-down phone had been quietly collecting. The clinic was clean and efficient, and the doctor who saw her was a woman named Dr. Patricia Owens, a general practitioner in her early 50s who had been practicing medicine long enough that very little surprised her. Diana sat on the examination table in a paper gown and answered questions about her symptoms and told herself again that it was probably stress. She told herself that nurses make the worst patients because we know too many things that can go wrong, and familiarity with illness makes us see it everywhere. The ultrasound was part of a broader diagnostic workup. Standard. Precautionary. Diana lay on the table and watched the ceiling while the wand moved and the machine translated what it found into an image on a screen. And she was already thinking about what she needed to pick up from the grocery store on the way home when she heard the quality of Dr. Owens's silence change. It was a shift so small that most people would not have caught it. Diana caught it instantly because she had produced that exact silence herself, standing at a bedside with information she was about to deliver to someone who was not yet prepared to receive it. Dr. Owens set the wand down. She looked at the screen for a moment longer than the moment required. Then she turned to Diana, and in the careful, measured tone of a physician who has learned that the words you choose in this particular kind of moment matter enormously, she said, "Diana, I need to ask you some questions about your husband." Not, "Are you feeling okay?" Not, "Let's talk about what we're seeing here." The first sentence out of her mouth was about Marcus. And Diana, who had spent 4 years building a fortress of reasonable explanations, and felt the entire structure come down in about 3 seconds. What the ultrasound had identified, combined with Diana's blood work, indicated the presence of a sexually transmitted infection, one that, in its more advanced presentation, can cause serious internal complications, one that Marcus, given the medical evidence in the timeline, had almost certainly been carrying and had not disclosed. Dr. Owens was careful in how she framed what she said next. She was not accusatory. She was not dramatic. She laid out the medical facts with the kind of quiet precision that Diana, in her nursing experience, recognized as the delivery style of someone who has had to be the bearer of very hard news many times before. And then she said, and Diana has repeated this sentence exactly the same way every time she has recounted this moment. "I want to make sure you're safe. And I think, until you have more clarity about your situation, you should consider what it means to remain in that home." Diana got dressed, walked out of the clinic, sat down in the driver's seat of her car, and did not start the engine for 47 minutes. She stared at the parking lot. She stared at nothing. And then she picked up her phone and called her sister. Before we go deeper into what happened next, we'd love to know, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or your country in the comments below. We read every single one, and this community of people who care about real stories, real lives, and real truth is one of the things that makes doing this work genuinely meaningful. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like Diana's are exactly why this channel exists. Diana's sister, whose name is Michelle, is 2 years younger and has been described by everyone in their family as the more immediately reactive of the two. Where Diana internalizes, Michelle externalizes, which meant that Michelle's response to the phone call in the parking lot involved a significant amount of language I will not reproduce here. But what Michelle did, after the initial reaction, was exactly what Diana needed. She did not tell Diana what to feel. She did not say, "I told you so," or even though she had harbored private reservations about Marcus that she had kept to herself out of respect for her sister's happiness. She said, "Tell me what you want to do. Whatever you want to do, I'm with you." What Diana wanted to do, it turned out, was move carefully. She was a nurse. She was trained to assess a situation before she acted on it. She did not go home and confront Marcus that night. She went home and made dinner, and watched television and lay beside her husband in the dark and listened to him breathe. And she thought about every Thursday evening, every garage phone call, every explanation she had accepted, and she began to understand that the question she needed answered was not just who is R. The question she needed answered was, who exactly is Marcus? Diana made 3 calls in the 48 hours after that parking lot. The first was to Michelle. The second was to a family law attorney named Deborah Haynes, a woman who had been practicing in Columbus for 26 years and who, within 20 minutes of hearing Diana's account, had begun outlining the initial steps of a divorce proceeding. The third call was to a private investigator. His name was Carl Webb, 61 years old, a former Franklin County Sheriff's deputy who had left law enforcement after 20 years and spent the following decade in private practice, taking the cases that interested him. His office was in a strip mall off Morse Road, between a dry cleaner and a tax preparation service, and Diana sat across from him at a laminate desk and told him everything. The letter R, the Thursdays, the P.O. box, the second name on the credit card. And Carl listened without interrupting, without writing anything down, just listening with the particular quality of attention that Diana recognized as the professional version of the same quality she brought to her own patients when they were trying to tell her something that mattered. When she finished, Carl was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay, give me 72 hours and I'll tell you what you're actually dealing with." Carl Webb had worked fraud cases, missing persons, insurance investigations, and custody disputes. He told me later that within the first 48 hours of the Callaway case, he knew he was looking at something significantly more complex than a standard infidelity investigation. The financial structure alone, he said, it was not the work of someone who had made a mistake. It was the work of someone who had been doing this for a very long time. The woman behind the letter R was named Rachel Simmons. She was 31 years old, a marketing coordinator at a tech company in Dublin, Ohio, a suburb 40 minutes from the Callaway home. She had been involved with Marcus, Carl established, for just under 3 years. She believed, as far as Carl could determine without directly approaching her, that she and Marcus were in what she understood to be a serious and exclusive relationship that he had described to her as complicated by a marriage he had told her was, in his words, essentially over. Rachel Simmons was not a villain in this story. Rachel Simmons was a woman who had been lied to in a different direction than Diana had been lied to. But Rachel was not the complete picture. Carl dug deeper, the way good investigators do, not just forward into the present, but backward into the past. And what he found in Marcus's financial records, legally obtained through the early stages of the divorce proceeding, was a structure that did not support a single hidden relationship. It supported a pattern, a second credit card, a third email address. Records of hotel stays in cities Marcus had claimed were business trips, in dates that aligned with gaps and inconsistencies Carl found when he cross-referenced Marcus's claimed calendar against his actual location data. Within 3 weeks, Carl had identified evidence suggesting that Marcus had been maintaining multiple simultaneous relationships, not just with Rachel, but with at least 2 other women, across 3 states. Women who did not know about Diana, women who did not know about each other, and women who, Carl would later learn, had each been told a version of Marcus that was specifically tailored to what that particular woman needed to believe. Diana waited. This is the part of the story that people find difficult to understand when they hear it from the outside, and I think it is worth taking a moment to explain it, because it is actually the part that tells you the most about who Diana Carter is. She had Carl's preliminary findings. She had her attorney's guidance. She had the medical documentation from Dr. Owens. She had, in other words, enough to act on. But she chose, deliberately, to wait until a Thursday. Because on Thursday evenings between 6 and 9 p.m., she knew where Marcus's attention would be. And she knew that a confrontation attempted in the middle of a deception has a different quality than a confrontation that catches the deception in the act of itself. She set a digital recorder, legally permissible under Ohio law, on the kitchen counter beside the fruit bowl, obscured behind a stack of mail. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table. And at 9:22 p.m., she heard Marcus's key in the front door. What happened in that kitchen over the following hour and 40 minutes was recorded in its entirety and later played, in edited form, during the civil proceedings. Diana presented Carl's documents. She placed Dr. Owens's written findings on the table. She asked Marcus, with a composure that she later said cost her more effort than anything she had ever done in her professional life, to explain what she was looking at. Marcus sat down across from her. He looked at the documents for a long moment, and then he said, not with defensiveness, not with anger, not with the performance of a man who has been caught and is scrambling, he said with something closer to exhaustion, "I've been waiting for this conversation for a long time." I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment because Diana has said that it is the thing that haunts her most about that night. More than the documents, more than the medical implications, more than everything that came after. Not that Marcus said I'm sorry. Not that Marcus said it wasn't what it looked like. Not that Marcus said anything a guilty man typically says when the wall he has built comes down around him. He said he had been waiting for it. Waiting. What, as though the conversation were a destination he had been traveling toward and had simply been a question of when they would arrive. In the hours and days that followed, as the full picture began to emerge through the investigation and the legal proceedings, Diana would come back to that sentence repeatedly, trying to understand what it meant. Was it relief? Was it, on some level, the exhaustion of a man who had been maintaining an enormous lie for so long that part of him wanted someone to finally see through it? Was it something darker, a kind of satisfaction? She has never been able to answer that definitively. Marcus, in the months that followed, would say very little to anyone. His attorney instructed him not to speak publicly. He did not offer Diana an explanation of the kind she actually wanted, not a legal explanation, or not a denial or an admission, but a human explanation, a reason. The kind of reason that might have made it possible not to forgive, but to understand. That explanation never came. Diana moved out of the marital home within 10 days of that kitchen conversation and went to stay with Michelle. Marcus remained in the house on the advice of his attorney. Deborah Haynes, Diana's attorney, had filed the initial divorce paperwork within 48 hours of that Thursday night and had begun the formal discovery process, the legal mechanism that compels both parties to disclose financial information. And it was through that process that the scope of what Marcus had been doing began to fully emerge. A forensic accountant brought in to review the Callaway finances spent 6 weeks going through 5 years of bank records, credit card statements, our tax filings, and investment account histories. What she found was not straightforward financial fraud. Marcus had not stolen Diana's money. He had not opened credit accounts in her name, or drained their joint savings or done any of the things that typically accompany this kind of deception when money is the primary motive. The accounts were irregular, the P.O. box card, the second checking account, but they were funded with Marcus's own income, not Diana's. Which raised a question that Deborah Haynes said she and the forensic accountant discussed at length, because it was the question that reframed the entire case. If Marcus was not doing this for money, then what was the engine behind it? What was driving a man who appeared by objective measure to have a good life, a good career, a good home, a community that respected him, to construct and maintain an architecture of deception this elaborate, this sustained, this carefully managed? The answer to that question was still weeks away, and it was more complicated than anyone in the room was prepared for. 6 months after that February morning in the clinic, on a Tuesday in August, Marcus Calloway was arrested at his place of work. He was taken out through a side exit, which his attorney had negotiated as a condition of a voluntary surrender, into a waiting vehicle and processed at the Franklin County Sheriff's Facility. He was not arrested on the basis of Diana's divorce proceedings. He was arrested because a detective named Lorraine Okafor, working a separate financial fraud investigation that had begun 7 months before Diana ever walked into that clinic. He had been following a trail of investment accounts, opened in women's names, without their full informed consent, quietly drained over periods of 2 to 4 years, and had identified the man behind them. The man in her case files was not listed as Marcus Calloway. He was listed as Marcus Trent, his original name, the name he had legally changed at 26, the name that appeared in records and documentation from a period of his life that Diana had known almost nothing about. The timeline of Detective Okafor's investigation stretched back not 3 years, not 5 years, 11 years. Before the name change, before Diana, before Rachel, before the charity galas and the basketball coaching and all of it. Oh, the pattern had begun more than a decade before the morning Diana sat in a clinic parking lot trying to understand what had just happened to her life. When Detective Okafor's case files intersected with the Calloway divorce proceedings, flagged by a paralegal in Deborah Haynes's office who ran a routine background check and found the discrepancy in the name, she walked the file down to her sergeant's office and said, with the particular flatness of a detective who has learned not to editorialize at these moments, "I think we have the same person." What emerged through the combined investigation, Detective Okafor's fraud case, the civil discovery process, and a subsequent deeper background review, was a portrait of a man who had spent his entire adult life constructing and reconstructing versions of himself. Marcus Trent was born in a small town in rural Tennessee, the youngest of 4 children raised in conditions that, when they came out during the pre-sentencing phase of his criminal proceedings, made people in the courtroom go quiet in a way that was distinct from the quiet of the earlier proceedings. His childhood had been defined by instability, by the particular kind of poverty that is also an absence of safety, by a series of caregiving failures that a forensic psychiatrist would later characterize as severe enough to produce significant long-term consequences for his ability to form genuine human attachments. He had left Tennessee at 19, spent several years moving between cities, and by his mid-20s had begun the process of becoming someone else. Not metaphorically, literally. He changed his legal name, and he built a new educational and professional history that was partly real and partly constructed. He identified the version of himself that other people responded to most positively and refined it over years, the way a craftsman refines a technique, removing what didn't work, strengthening what did, until the performance was so polished that it no longer felt like a performance even to the person doing it. The women in Detective Okafor's fraud case, 5 of them, eventually identified through financial records, had each been involved with Marcus Trent in the years before his name change and his relocation to Ohio. Each had trusted him. Each had, to varying degrees, been financially exploited. None had connected their individual experiences to a single person, because Marcus was careful about geography and timing, and because each woman, in the aftermath, had done what women in painful situations are often encouraged to do, moved forward, not backward. The number, by the time all the evidence had been gathered and the legal proceedings were underway, was 7. 7 women across 11 years, across multiple states, each of whom had believed, with reasonable cause, that she was in a genuine relationship with Marcus. 7 women who had absorbed the medical consequences, the financial consequences, the emotional consequences of a deception they were not in a position to have detected, because the deception was not the work of an amateur or an opportunist, but of someone who had been doing this, methodically, for the entirety of his adult life. Diana was the last of the 7. She was also because of Dr. E. Owens and the clinic appointment and the medical documentation, the one whose situation created the legal foothold that brought everything down. On the first court date of Marcus's criminal proceedings, 6 of the 7 women were present in the gallery. They had not coordinated this. Several of them had been connected through the investigation and had been in contact in the preceding weeks, but the decision to attend was individual. Diana arrived early and was already seated when the others came in. She said later that she did not fully process what was happening until she looked down the row and saw women she had never met. Women of different ages, different backgrounds, different cities, sitting in the same room, carrying the same knowledge. She reached for the hand of the woman beside her, a woman named Sandra, who had been involved with Marcus 8 years before Diana met him, and Sandra took her hand without a word. Diana said it was the quietest, most profound act of recognition she had ever experienced. The trial lasted 11 days. The prosecution built its case methodically. Financial records, medical documentation, digital communications that had been extracted from devices seized at the time of Marcus's arrest, and testimony from 5 of the 7 women, each of whom took the stand and described in their own words their experience of a man who had been simultaneously many different things to many different people. The defense tried 3 separate arguments in sequence: that the financial arrangements had been consensual, that the health implications were unknowing and therefore not criminal, and that the pattern identified by prosecutors was a matter of interpretation rather than intent. The jury rejected all 3. Deliberations lasted 9 days, longer than anyone had anticipated, long enough that Diana began to prepare herself, privately, for an outcome she didn't want to name. On the 9th day, the jury returned. Guilty on 11 of 14 counts, including charges related to the deliberate transmission of a communicable disease, a felony under Ohio law, and multiple counts connected to the financial fraud scheme that Detective Okafor had spent 7 months building. Marcus stood at the defense table and received the verdict with the same composure he had brought to that kitchen table on a Thursday evening, with a stillness that gave nothing away. Diana, sitting 3 rows behind the prosecution, he looked at the back of his head and thought, she told me later, not about herself but about the 6 women beside her, about Sandra who had sat next to her on the first court date and held her hand, about the years each of them had lost to the same careful performance. At sentencing, Marcus received 9 years in an Ohio correctional facility. He would be eligible for parole review in 5. He issued no statement. He did not look at the gallery as he was let out. Diana Carter went back to nursing. She moved to a different city. She has asked, and I have agreed, not to say which one. She has become an advocate for clearer legal frameworks around communicable disease transmission and informed consent, and she speaks carefully and deliberately about her experience because, as she put it to me, "So I didn't go through all of this to stay quiet about it." That's not the lesson. The other women are living their lives in the ways that feel right to them. Some publicly, some privately, all with a particular kind of knowledge that comes from surviving something that was designed, very deliberately, to go undetected. Dr. Patricia Owens still practices medicine in Columbus. She was asked, in a brief interview for a local news segment after the verdict, whether she thought about the moment she slid that ultrasound result across the table to Diana. She said yes. She said she thinks about it sometimes. Not with drama or with pride, but with the quiet recognition that medicine is, at its best, about more than the immediate physical problem in front of you. I saw a patient, she said, who needed information that was going to change her life. My job was to give it to her clearly and to make sure she understood what her options were. That's what I tried to do. And Diana, sitting in a new city, in a new apartment, building a new version of her life, a version she owns entirely that no one is managing for her, says that is exactly what Dr. Owens did. She gave her the truth, even when the truth was the hardest thing in the room. There are moments in life that split everything in 2, before and after. Diana Carter is living in the after now, and she wants you to know. She wants every person watching this who has ever been handed an after they didn't ask for, that the after, as terrifying as it is, as disorienting as it is, as costly as it is, can also be the truest thing that ever happened to you. Now, I want to ask you something directly. When Marcus sat down in that kitchen and said he had been waiting for that conversation, what do you think he meant? Do you think that was relief? Guilt? Something else entirely? Leave your answer in the comments below because I genuinely want to know what you think. And here is the question Diana wants to leave you with. The one she asked me to make sure I passed on. She said, I want people to ask themselves, honestly, not judgmentally, honestly, How much of what they believe about the person they love is based on evidence, and how much is based on hope? That is not a cynical question. That is the question of a woman who has earned the right to ask it. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about trust or safety, or the careful architecture of the lives we build alongside other people, then please share it with someone you think should hear it. Subscribe if you haven't already, because the stories we tell on this channel are exactly this: real, complicated, human, and worth understanding. And next week, we are going into a case that begins with a missing will, a grieving family, and a single line in a legal document that one attorney noticed at the very last moment. A line that was never supposed to be found. You will not want to miss it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying. Take care of yourselves.